Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. We've all been told by the media, probably repeatedly, that the disease the Omicron variant will cause is likely to be only mild. But what we don't know is the scientific basis upon which that is said. My guest today has done landmark work to establish the scientific basis, and there's no one better than him to explain it. I'm joined now by Professor of Clinical Microbiology at the Cambridge Institute for Therapeutic, Immunology and Infectious Diseases, Professor Ravindra Gupta. Professor Gupta, let's start with your work at Cambridge, which explains why the disease caused by Omicron is likely to be less virulent than the disease caused by other variants of coronavirus. And if I've correctly understood your study, you have two reasons for saying this. The first is to do with what's called Omicron's cleavage efficiency. Could you explain this further in layman's language?
Yes, well, as we know, Omicron had a number of mutations, more than we've really ever seen before in coronavirus. And so it caused a lot of concern. And one of the key events in the virus's life cycle is the processing of this spike protein. The spike protein, remember, is sitting on the surface of the virus particle. It is, in a way, the key that unlocks the entry into a cell in order to infect it. So it has to match up with the receptor or the lock on the cell. Now, for that key to match, it has to be in the right conformation. It has to look right. And part of that process to make it take on the correct shape involves a cleavage. It involves taking the spike protein and cutting it in a particular place. And what that does is it allows those two pieces then to reassemble with each other in a very tight-fitting form for engagement with the cell that it's trying to infect. So this cleavage event is absolutely critical for a certain type of infection in certain types of cells.
Now, the second reason is to do with what I believe is the manner in which Omicron fuses with cells in the human body. And I believe as a result, unlike Delta, Omicron doesn't lead to the creation of giant infected cells that are often called Syncytia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Again, could you explain this further in layman's language?
Yes. So the fact that it doesn't cleave itself properly means that it can't use one of the pathways into a cell, and that pathway is present in the cells which are in the lower tract, the lower part of your airway. In other words, the lungs, and that's what we think is responsible for the more severe illness. It also is the pathway that's needed for the spike protein to generate this syncytia, in other words, to fuse cells together. And the reason that's important is because when a virus infects a cell and it's making lots of proteins of it, it's reproducing itself, it produces spike inside that cell, that factory, as it were, and that spike goes to the surface of that producer cell. And if it's next to another cell and can engage a receptor, it can then cause a fusion event without a virus particle being present. Just the spike protein alone itself can generate a fused cell, in other words, two cells becoming one. And as that process repeats itself, you get this thing called a syncytium, which is basically a lump of cells which are fused together to make one giant cell. And we think that's important because for some reason, it's associated with more severe disease in autopsy studies, although it's not a very tight association. But it also it potentially enables the virus to go from one cell to another very quickly and spread under the radar of the immune system, because the immune system requires the virus to be outside a cell in order for antibodies to work. And so if the virus can't do this efficiently, which Omicron appears not to, then the immune system may be better at seeing the virus and therefore stop it replicating earlier.
So in a nutshell, and I'm saying this in layman's language, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the fact that Omicron has a very poor cleavage efficiency means its capacity to enter cells is limited. And because it doesn't create these giant infected cells, Syncytia, it also is less likely to create serious illness. Both of these factors work towards limiting the virulence of the illness Omicron creates.
And that's a potential implication of it. And of course, we were doing these experiments whilst the disease was spreading and people were studying how well patients were doing in hospital. And so the data we're sort of suggesting does match up with what we're seeing in clinical practice. But importantly, of course, the virus is moving away from the cells in the lower lungs, but it's doing very, very well in the cells in the upper airway, which we've recently showed. In other words, in the nose and potentially the throat and the upper airways, where the disease caused will be less severe, but still the level of virus production is still very high for Omicron. And we can show that it's just as good as Delta in the upper airways.
Absolutely. And this is the second important part of your study. It shows that, in fact, and I believe I'm right in saying yours was the first study to show this, but since then there have been 4 or 5 or 6 others internationally, and they all show that Omicron is extremely good at affecting the upper airways, what's called the bronchus, but nowhere near as good at affecting the lung. And this is another reason why the disease Omicron creates is likely to be mild and likely to last 4 or 5 days rather than be severe and lead to lung impairment.
I mean, that is true, but it's not absolutely 100%. In other words, the virus can still do some infection of those lower airway cells. It's just not as efficient. It's not as high. And therefore, if you're unvaccinated, you still have a significant chance of developing severe disease and dying. So you must be vaccinated for this to lead to a milder disease. We still are seeing very severe infections in people who are unvaccinated and who are getting infected with Omicron. So this is not a reason to limit vaccination or to not get a vaccine. It is actually a reason to be vaccinated, because if you are vaccinated, then you are very well protected even against this new variant.
Absolutely. Everything you said about the need for vaccination holds true, and I'll underline that for the audience. But what I'll also point out to the audience is you've just given us the scientific basis and explanation for why, in fact, all the data from both Britain and South Africa is suggesting that although there may be a huge explosion in cases, hospitalization, the severity of the disease and the length to which it lasts is very different to Delta. Your scientific studies have established the explanation for what the data was showing earlier.
That's right. I think we were seeing that the oxygen requirements for patients was markedly lower in South Africa than for the Delta wave. Now, the issue there in interpretation was, of course, that Delta had already swept through South Africa. There was a degree of immunity to coronavirus in the population, and we were not sure whether the observation of reduced severity was due to this, some underlying immunity. Now, in the UK, we've been able to compare Delta versus Omicron more directly, and there does appear to be a solid difference in oxygen requirements. But of course, we're still seeing lots of people getting sick enough to be in hospital, because what this virus is doing is tipping people over the edge, the elderly, the infirm, those with other conditions. This virus is tipping them into hospitalization nonetheless.
Absolutely. But whereas earlier we weren't sure whether the milder form of disease Omicron was creating was as a result of either previous infection or result of vaccination, now we know that it's also very substantially, because intrinsically this variant is less virulent. And your study has shown that.
That's right. And then just the last thing to say really is just that the next variant may not be doing this. It may be reverting back to the original. And that's what I predict. I don't predict the next variant will be like Omicron. I think it will be more like Delta, but with more immune escape.
Well, that is a moment that we should be very sober and hear carefully. You're predicting that the next variant will not be mild like Omicron, but more severe like Delta.
Yes, I believe so. I think this is an evolutionary kind of mistake by the virus. I mean, it's not a mistake for the virus because it transmits super well. It's a mistake for us in terms of generating illness, which of course is not the primary goal of the virus. So it's made a mistake that's beneficial for the virus, and that's why the mistake was propagated and is so successful. But it's a mistake in terms of how deadly it is for us. But the next variant may have a different evolutionary path and probably will.
Can I just ask, is this your hunch, or do you have scientific reason for believing that the next variant will be more virulent and that this milder form is, in fact, as you called it, an evolutionary mistake?
There isn't really any hard evidence, just to say that this is the first time we've seen such a characteristic in a virus, and all the previous variants going before this have had a particular phenotype or behavioral characteristics.
Okay, let me ask you a few more questions about Omicron. I'll move away from your prediction about the nature of the next virus, though that will undoubtedly worry people. Now, we know that Omicron can easily overcome the antibody arm of vaccine protection. How does it fare against cellular immunity, T cells and B cells?
Well, there are some studies in preprint at the moment suggesting that T cell immunity is preserved, which I think is excellent. And that means that also is a potential explanation for the milder disease, because of course, all these mutations make the antibodies less effective, but at least the cellular immunity arm of our defenses is still functional. But it also tells you that the virus really doesn't care about T cell immunity when it's trying to infect a person and evolve along its evolutionary trajectory. So it's actually, again, good fortune for us that our T cells are still working. But the reason for that is that T cells exert a much less important role in controlling virus infection when these variants are evolving. So remember, the variants are evolving not to create damage or to make people sick, but they're just trying to replicate and persist and give rise to daughter virions. So that process is blocked by antibodies, and that's why the virus actively tries to avoid the antibodies, but not the T cells.
Absolutely. Poorer antibody immunity means that a virus like Omicron will spread a lot faster and more rapidly. But well-maintained T cell immunity does mean that if you fall ill, you will be protected against severe disease.
Yes, we think so. We think the T cells are mediating or operational in protecting us from severe disease.
Now, we know from South Africa that they believe their Omicron wave has peaked. And in fact, on New Year's Eve, they fairly radically reduced the nighttime curfew. Is Omicron behaving similarly in Britain? Do you anticipate a peak in the near future? And then do you believe cases will similarly tumble down very fast?
Yes, I mean, we are hitting over 200,000 cases a day. I think we will peak certainly in the next couple of weeks. I think certainly before the month is over, and we will start seeing a decline. I think there is also already some sign of decline in London. But of course, the hospitalizations may continue to rise because, of course, the lag between case numbers and more severe disease or complications from coronavirus. So yes, we are probably near the peak here.
Let me quote what Dr. Anthony Fauci said the other day and ask if you agree. He says, given that Omicron is highly infectious and creates a huge number of cases, but also given that the disease is considerably less severe, he believes we need to change our strategy for tackling it. His exact words are, it's much more relevant to focus on the hospitalizations as opposed to the total number of cases. And in a sense, that is, I suspect, what Boris Johnson's government is doing in Britain. Do you agree with this change of strategy and approach?
Yes, I do. I mean, people have started discussing this during the Delta variant, and to say that vaccines were efficacious in preventing hospitalization and death. And that was what we should be looking at rather than raw case numbers. So I definitely agree with the fact that we need to move towards looking at the more severe end of the spectrum. But of course, again, the next variant may rewrite the rules again. So this is a temporary measure, I think, for this particular variant, and we will need to adapt our policies based on what we're seeing arising.
Two more questions before I let you go, Professor Gupta. And the first picks up on that thought you just said, that the next variant may rewrite the rules. And that, in a sense, was a reflection of your saying that your prediction is that the next variant will be much more virulent, more like Delta, less like Omicron, because Omicron, in a sense, you said, is an evolutionary mistake. Now, there are reports that the French have found in southern France a new variant called B16402 or IHU, and it's said to have 46 mutations. Could this possibly be the next and this time more virulent variant, or do we just not know enough?
I think we need to wait and see. Of course, it's trying to compete with a highly successful virus that transmits very well and replicates very well in the upper airways. So it's going to have a hard time getting traction. It's also been around for a little while and has not escalated in an extreme way, as we saw with Omicron. So we should keep an eye on viruses like this. They will continue to emerge, and we need to apply the knowledge to each variant as they arise.
If I understand what the WHO has said yesterday about this particular one, IHU or B16402, they point out that it was detected roughly the same time as Omicron, i.e. sometime towards the third week of November. But the number of cases that have been established so far don't seem to be more than 12, whereas Omicron has spread around the world in thousands, if not millions. Does that suggest that people are worried by this because it has 46 mutations, but actually it's not showing any of the virulence or rate of speed that Omicron showed? So far, it's not even been declared a variant of interest, leave aside a variant of concern.
Yes, I think that focusing just on the raw number of mutations is a bit too simplistic, and understanding what the mutations are, and what they're doing is more important. We have suffered from a severe lack of biological funding to do characterization of viruses, and I think that's why we're in the position we are in, where we're having to find things out very quickly. And as we go forward, we should invest better in that sort of research so that we do predict with higher certainty what the virus is going to do.
But at the moment, given what we know, there is no reason for alarm about B16402.
Not at the moment.
My last question. There are reports, and I think I'm right in saying from the University of Birmingham, that suggest that AstraZeneca, which we in India, as you know, called Covishield, produces better cellular immunity than mRNA vaccines. Do you believe those reports are true and accurate?
I don't really believe them wholesale, because, of course, now people are having different vaccinations. They're having 2 AstraZenecas, then their third is the Pfizer vaccine, for example, or mRNA vaccine for their third dose. So, you've got to remember that T-cell immunity, these things need to be measured over long periods of time. We're not going to get that data now because they've been boosted with mRNA. It could be potentially true, but we've got to remember that AZ was associated with more vaccine breakthrough, and it was, and that translated to more severe cases with AstraZeneca. So despite, if there was better T-cell immunity, it did not protect those breakthrough infections in AZ from getting more sick. So the key thing is getting more doses, and we believe if you've had 2 AZs, then we should consider a different form of vaccine for the third. But of course, if you've had previous infection, which many in India have, then that may be less of an issue because you've already had, in other words, a vaccination from a previous infection. So we do need more data from India to understand immunity there.
But you said something very important in that answer, that if you had 2 AZs, which we call Covishield, the third jab ought to be a different vaccine, preferably an mRNA vaccine. But since those are not available in India, I suppose it could be a protein vaccine like Covovax, which you call Novavax. That would be better than a third jab of AstraZeneca.
Well, we've not compared Novavax with AstraZeneca as a third dose, so it's hard to say that. It may be that Covaxin, which is widely available, is an acceptable third dose, even though Covaxin itself induces relatively lower levels of immune responses compared to Covishield.
Okay, I won't quibble. I'll just point out that I think the University of Southampton actually has compared Covovax as a third jab along with a third jab of AstraZeneca after 2. And it shows that, in fact, the geometric mean ratio goes up 3.25 times after a third jab of AstraZeneca, but it goes up over 8 times if your third jab is Covovax or what you call Novavax.
Good. But the only other thing to bear in mind is we don't know about the longevity of those responses. So these are very short-term studies and need to be interpreted with caution.
I thank you, Professor Gupta, for this interview. In particular, I thank you for the scientific basis and the explanation in layman's terms of the reason why you believe the disease Omicron will create is likely to be only mild. But I fear that what the audience will remember is your prediction that the next variant is going to be more virulent, much more like Delta than Omicron, because, as you said, Omicron, in your eyes, looks like an evolutionary mistake. I fear that the message the audience will take will be that, rather than the understanding of why you believe the disease is mild. But that is life, and that is what we have to face.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Yes, thank you.